The price of faith, the streets of Jerusalem were alive with rumors. A strange new sect had risen among the Jews, whispering about a crucified teacher who had risen from the dead. At first, it was little more than murmurs in the markets and heated debates in the synagogues, but then the movement began to spread. Fishermen, tax collectors, women who once went unnoticed in the temple courts, all were speaking of visions, healings, and a spirit that seemed to burn like fire inside them. The apostles, once trembling in fear, now spoke boldly in the temple courts. Crowds gathered as Peter proclaimed that Jesus of Nazareth was not dead, but alive, and that in his name sins could be forgiven. For the authorities, this was not only blasphemy, but also danger. A people who believed in a different kind of kingdom might be tempted to challenge the order of Rome, and that was something neither priest nor governor could allow. It began with Stephen. He was young, full of wisdom, and his words cut through lies like a sword. Before the council, he stood accused of speaking against the law in the temple, but his face, the witnesses said, was like that of an angel. When they dragged him outside the city and stoned him, he prayed with blood in his mouth, "Lord, do not hold this sin against them." And when the stones had finished their work, the earth itself seemed to shudder. Those who saw it never forgot. Persecution followed like a storm. Homes were raided, families scattered. Some fled to Samaria, some to Antioch, some to the far edges of the empire. A man named Saul made it his mission to hunt them down, dragging men and women into prisons. Yet in the very act of crushing them, the message spread. The fire scattered, but wherever it fell, new sparks lit. When Saul himself was struck blind on the road to Damascus, the persecutor became the preacher. His conversion shook the movement like thunder, and soon the name of Christ was being heard in cities Rome had conquered centuries earlier. In marketplaces, in poor towns, in the houses of the poor, a message took root that there was a kingdom not of Caesar, but of God. Rome tolerated many gods, but Rome had no patience for rivals. As long as Christians were mistaken for Jews, their faith was tolerated as part of an old, peculiar religion. But when their identity stood alone, when they refused sacrifices to the emperor, when they rejected the festivals of Rome, they became strangers in their own cities. Neighbors whispered that Christians drank blood because they spoke of the cup. They said Christians were cannibals because they ate the body. They said Christians were atheists because they denied the gods of Rome. And when famine struck, or plague swept through the streets, or the Tiber flooded its banks, there were always fingers pointing. It is the Christians who anger the gods. The storm broke fiercest under Nero. The year was 64 AD when fire consumed Rome, leaping from wooden roof to wooden roof until nearly half the city was ash and ruin. The people seethed with anger, and whispers accused the emperor himself of ordering the flames. Nero needed a scapegoat. He found one in the Christians. The order went out, round them up. Men and women were dragged from their homes, beaten and chained. Some were sewn into animal skins and thrown to dogs. Some were crucified along the roads. And some, horrifyingly, were covered in pitch and set alight torches for Nero's gardens while he laughed and sang from his balcony. It was said that the air in Rome stank not only of smoke, but of burning flesh. And yet, in the arenas where lions roared and crowds screamed, the Christians sang. They sang hymns as teeth tore flesh, as steel struck bone, as flames licked their skin. A faith that was meant to be crushed only grew bolder. Tertullian, centuries later, would write words that echoed their defiance. Asterisk, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. Asterisk, even in death, the martyrs seemed unconquered. Peter, tradition holds, was crucified upside down, unworthy, he said, to die as his Lord did. Paul, the former persecutor turned apostle, was beheaded by the sword. His letters already spreading across the empire like living fire. Their deaths were meant to silence the message. Instead, their memory made it eternal. Beneath the streets of Rome, in narrow tunnels carved into the earth, the Christians gathered. The catacombs became both tomb and sanctuary, where the bodies of the saints lay beside flickering lamps and painted symbols of hope. The fish, the anchor, the chiro all whispered of faith to those who dared descend into the darkness. They worshipped quietly, prayed for strength, and shared bread and wine in remembrance of the one who had died and risen. And though Rome's power was vast, it could not silence what was born in those shadows. The years passed and the empire shifted. Nero fell, but suspicion of Christians never died. Rome was a city of many gods, each tied to fortune, war, and harvest. To neglect the gods was dangerous, to mock them was treason, and to refuse the emperor's cult was unthinkable. Christians who prayed to one unseen God and who would not bow before the images of Caesar became the perfect target whenever unrest stirred. Under Domitian, whispers became decrees. He demanded to be hailed as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. To the Christian ear, such words were blasphemy. Those who refused were branded atheists and traitors. Executions became spectacles. Possessions of Christians were confiscated. Some were exiled to remote islands, banished to die forgotten. Among them was the Apostle John, who carried his visions of the risen Christ to the rocky solitude of Patmos. There he wrote of a kingdom greater than Rome, of a throne before which emperors were dust, and of a Lamb who conquered not with legions, but with blood. Elsewhere, governors faced a dilemma. Pliny the Younger, sent to govern Bithynia around 112 AD, wrote to Emperor Trajan with unease. He had interrogated Christians, some very young, and found them guilty of nothing more than gathering before dawn, singing hymns to Christ as to a god, and swearing to live morally. Shall I punish them for the name alone? Pliny asked. Trajan's reply was cold and pragmatic. Christians were not to be hunted, but if accused and proven guilty, they must be punished unless they renounced their faith and sacrificed to the gods. It was a test repeated across the empire: offer incense to Caesar or face death. Many stumbled, hands trembling as they lifted the incense to save their families. But others stood firm. They refused to betray the one they called Lord, even if it meant fire, sword, or beasts. In the city of Smyrna, an old man named Polycarp became a living legend. He was 86 years old, a bishop loved by his flock when soldiers came for him. Friends urged him to flee, but he refused, saying, "Let the will of God be done." They dragged him before the governor, who urged him, "Swear by Caesar's fortune. Curse Christ, and I will release you." Polycarp's reply rang through the hall. 86 years I have served him, and he has never wronged me. How can I blaspheme my king who saved me? The crowd roared for blood. Wood was piled high in the arena. Polycarp was bound, but when they set the torch to the pyre, witnesses swore the flames arched around him like a wind-blown sail, leaving him unharmed. In the end, a soldier's blade struck him down, and the fragrance of his sacrifice lingered in memory long after the smoke faded. Polycarp was not alone. In Carthage, a young noblewoman named Perpetua faced death with her infant still at her breast. Beside her was Felicity, a slave and expectant mother who gave birth in prison just days before her execution. When they were led into the arena, beasts rushed upon them, but their faith did not falter. Perpetua, struck down, guided the gladiator's trembling hand to her own throat, showing that her death was not defeat but triumph. Their courage became a story retold in whispers, strengthening others who faced the same fate. These martyrs were not kings, nor warriors, nor poets. They were ordinary men and women, slaves and nobles, children and elders. Yet their blood wrote a testimony more powerful than any decree of Rome. The empire meant to erase them, but instead their memory carved new strength into the bones of the faithful. By the 3rd century, the church was everywhere, quietly growing in houses, markets, and even among soldiers in the legions. Rome had the sword, but Christians had something Rome could not touch, a hope stronger than death. Governors complained that the temples are deserted, the sacrifices neglected. Pagan priests watched as their flocks dwindled, while Christian communities flourished in secret. Still, the sword was never far away. Emperors rose and fell, and each brought new storms. Under Decius in 249 AD, the empire demanded loyalty oaths from every citizen. Each was required to sacrifice to the gods and obtain a certificate, a libellus, proving obedience. To hold such a paper was to live, to refuse was to die. Many faltered. Some bribed officials for false papers, but others stood firm, knowing it would cost their lives. Families were divided. Some wept as fathers were led to execution. Some churches struggled to welcome back those who had lapsed under pressure, but the faith endured. Even as Rome tried to stamp it out with bureaucratic precision, the words of Christ, "Do not fear those who kill the body," echoed in secret gatherings. And still, the storm had not reached its height. By the dawn of the 4th century, the Christian faith was no longer a whisper in the markets or a rumor in the alleys. It had spread into villages, cities, even the military. Senators and togas secretly prayed to Christ, while slaves whispered his name in kitchens. The empire could no longer ignore them, and so Rome, proud and fearful, struck with all its might. Diocletian was emperor, a soldier hardened by war, devoted to restoring Rome's fading glory. To him, unity meant obedience, and obedience meant worship of the old gods who had carried Rome to power. Christians who refused to sacrifice threatened the fragile fabric of the empire. In 303 AD, his decrees thundered across every province. Christian assemblies were banned, churches torn down, scriptures burned, and those who persisted were to be imprisoned, tortured, or killed. It was called the Great Persecution, and for many, it seemed the world itself had turned against them. Soldiers smashed open church doors, dragging out sacred books to feed the flames. Mosaics and crosses were ripped from walls, chalices seized, altars overturned. Families who had prayed together for years were scattered in a single night. In Nicomedia, where Diocletian ruled, the emperor ordered the great church leveled to the ground. Flames consumed its library of scriptures, and smoke curled into the winter sky like an offering to false gods. Across the empire, prisons filled with bishops and deacons, their hymns echoing through the stone halls even as chains bit their wrists. But persecution did not only strike leaders. It fell upon the ordinary faithful, the women who hid fragments of scripture in their aprons, the craftsmen who carved crosses in secret, the soldiers who refused to bow to Caesar's image. Many were scourged until their backs were raw. Some were burned alive. Others were stretched on the rack until their bones cracked. To break the will of the church, Rome aimed to break its body. Yet stories spread of courage that no iron could crush. In Alexandria, believers were torn by iron claws, yet sang psalms until their voices broke. In Carthage, Christians marched into the arena greeting beasts with hymns instead of screams. Even children, when threatened, clung to the name of Christ with a fierceness that unnerved their executioners. One tale told of a woman who hid fragments of the gospel in her home. When soldiers burst in, demanding she surrender the texts, she refused. "Without the scriptures," she said, "we have no life." They dragged her away, but the pages she guarded survived, passed from hand to trembling hand. Such acts, small in the eyes of men, became monuments in the memory of the faithful, and still the empire pressed harder. Under Galerius, Diocletian's co-ruler, cruelty only deepened. Some Christians were roasted on griddles, others flayed alive. In one province, entire villages were slaughtered when they refused to renounce the faith. The empire seemed determined to grind Christianity into dust. But the more Rome struck, the more the church endured. It was as if the blood of the martyrs watered an unseen field, and from their sacrifice a harvest grew. Secret gatherings continued, prayers whispered in catacombs, bread broken in candlelit rooms. Hope lived on, carried in the quiet courage of the living and the defiant songs of the dying. At last, even the persecutors faltered. Galerius, struck with a wasting disease, issued an edict in 311 AD halting the persecutions. His body failed even as his empire trembled, and in the shadows the church, scarred, bloodied, but unbroken, awaited the dawn of freedom. 2 years later, in a vision that would change history, the soldier Constantine prepared for battle. He looked to the heavens and saw, or believed he saw, a sign, a cross of light above the sun, and the words, "In this sign conquer." From that day, the empire that had once hunted Christians began to shield them. Their great persecution had ended, but its memory would never fade. It was written into the bones of the faithful, sung in their hymns, carved on the walls of their tombs. Rome had tried to silence them with fire and sword. Instead, it forged a faith that would outlast emperors and empires. The empire that once tried to strangle the church now found itself changed by it. Constantine, hardened general and shrewd ruler, rose from the chaos of civil war with the sign of the cross before him. Whether vision or strategy, it altered the destiny of millions. At the Milvian Bridge in 312 AD, his armies marched under shields marked with the Piro, the emblem of Christ. When victory came, Constantine declared that the God of the Christians had given him triumph. The following year, he issued the Edict of Milan, declaring tolerance for all religions. For the first time in history, Christians could worship openly without fear of chains or death. The doors of prisons creaked open, and bishops stepped out into sunlight after years in the dark. Hidden scriptures preserved in secret at risk of life were brought into the open. Churches that had been burned or demolished began to rise again, their stones laid with hands that once trembled under persecution. For the faithful, it was a dizzying transformation. Just yesterday, they had gathered in catacombs, whispering hymns in the dark. Now they sang in basilicas, their voices echoing under vaulted roofs. Crosses, once symbols of shame and execution, were lifted on banners and carved into marble. The faith of fishermen, slaves, and martyrs had found itself at the heart of the empire. And yet, even in triumph, the memory of suffering remained. Families still carried scars from the days of the Great Persecution. In villages, widows remembered the day soldiers dragged their husbands away. In cities, some still wept over children who had been thrown to beasts. The church bore these memories not as wounds of defeat, but as testimonies of endurance. They became the stories passed from parent to child, shaping the very soul of the faith. Eusebius, the historian of the age, recorded the tales of martyrs with reverence, their courage shining like stars against the night of Rome's cruelty. He told of men who sang as flames consumed them, of women who walked calmly into the arena, of prisoners who converted their jailers with kindness. To later generations, these stories were more than history. They were reminders of what it cost to follow Christ in a world that hated him. Some wondered if peace might weaken the church more than persecution ever had. In the days of fire and blood, faith had been clear. To confess Christ was to risk all. Now, with emperors favoring the church, positions of honor and wealth crept into its walls. Bishops debated not only doctrine, but power. Councils met to settle disputes, while emperors themselves weighed in on theology. The world that had once pressed the church into martyrdom now invited it into palaces. But the foundation remained. Beneath the grandeur of new cathedrals, beneath the debates and politics, the memory of the martyrs still spoke. The catacombs still held their bones. The faded frescoes they still whispered of hope, and the hymns sung in secret still rang in the hearts of believers. The early church had been born in the shadow of a cross, tested in the fire of persecution, and watered with the blood of its saints. Rome had tried to crush it, but in doing so had given it strength beyond measure. No empire, no sword, no flame could erase it. In time, the empire itself would crumble, its legions scattered, its temples silent. But the faith that Rome once despised would live on, carried across continents, spoken in 1,000 tongues, held in the hands of emperors and peasants alike. The testimony of those first centuries, their courage, their suffering, their unshakable hope, would forever echo in the words of Christ, "The gates of hell shall not prevail against it." Amen.